Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're talking about a historically important essay here in our radical engagement. We're talking about Carol Hanisch's The Personal is Political, which was first published, I believe, in 1969, was spread widely and republished in 1970. It is the origins of the phrase, the personal is political, that became cliche by the end of the 1970s. Hanisch is an interesting figure. Unlike someone like Gloria Steinem, she's more associated with the radical feminist end of the feminists in the second wave and in the New Left. She published a book with editors Shmula Miff Firestone and Ann Code, and Notes from a Second Year Women's Liberation. She was also somewhat famous in the late 1960s for pioneering the Miss America protest, and was one of the 4 people who hung a women's liberation banner over the balcony at the pageant that year, disrupting the proceedings. She is pretty much famous for 3 things. One is the essay we're about to talk about, because while she didn't coin the personal is political, she doesn't claim to either. She said it was coined from the movement itself and codified by the editors of Women's Liberation. She did kind of put it in print for the first time, or at least codified it as a concept in print for the first time. She's also associated with the radical feminist of the 60s, but also the radical feminist of the aught teens. She, with a few other people, Ty Grace Anderson and Kathy Scarchild, wrote a criticism of gender that later would inspire gender critical feminists, where that term sort of shifted from its meaning in the late 60s and 70s up through Adriana Dorkin and Catherine McKinnon, and now where it's at, often associated with, quote, trans exclusionary feminism. There's a lot to parse in her life. In 1996, she also raised a lot of hackles because she spoke at a symposium on the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution at the New School for Social Research, where she defended William Hinton's Fanzine and Mao Zedong's public statements for inspiring the women's liberation movement of the 1960s, and said it was a combination of Maoist theory and Black liberation theory, particularly the Maoist notions of speaking bitterness and self-criticism that helped develop the idea of consciousness-raising groups from the feminist movement, particularly from Marxist feminists and feminist socialists, many of whom abandoned socialism later on. So she is part of what is often called the liberalization of Maoist thought that occurred in the transition between the New Left and the New Communist movement. Often we talk about those movements interchangeably, but they really aren't. The New Left does have a Marxian core to it, but notice I said Marxian, not Marxist. The New Communist movement was really inspired by Maoism and by student activism, by the Black Liberation movement, and by some of the movements amongst late Trotskyism and their participation in the free speech protests of the late 1960s. I bring all this up because the personal is political is kind of like Peggy McClintock's The Invisible Knapsack, which is where our liberal version in third wave and intersectional feminism of privilege theory comes from, particularly in regards to race. I think in many ways they're of very different eras. Peggy McClintock was a feminist working at a pedagogical education school coming out of the New Left in the 80s. Whereas this piece by Hanisch is coming very much in real time in the late 1960s by people who are primarily activist and are on the more radical end of things. However, both were incorporated together in the kind of liberal feminism or intersectional feminism that emerged in the 1990s, aughts, and aught teens. And there's kind of a way that this is taught to liberals and even in high school now that I think is somewhat misleading. But the personal is political became a cliche even when I was in college in the late 90s and early aughts already. And if you go back and read a lot of the stuff from the 70s, you have Marxists complaining about it. And people like Christopher Lasch complaining about it are adopting it all the way back to like 1971, 1972. So this made a lot of waves. What I'm surprised at, just looking at the actual piece by Carol Hanisch, is that it's not very long. In fact, the introductory intro she wrote for her website on women's liberation in 2006 is almost as long as the original article. So we're going to tackle that. I also kind of like going into Carol Hanisch's webpage because it was kind of a little bit out of date even in 2006, 2007 when it was posted. It's very old internet. And as a person who was an adult, you know, this was the aesthetics of my early 20s. It's kind of nostalgic for me. So I'm just going to show it to you. But also, I think reading this and seeing how this idea shifted over time and how it was so incorporable into more liberal feminist theories and more liberal activist circles is actually really important because it's something I complain about a lot. And I want to see how much it's in the original article because, like I said, Hanisch is a much more radical figure. I mean, I know Firestone's, someone who is associated with Hanisch, a lot more. I've read The Dialectic of Sex. I think even back when I was editing, when I was a reader and intro editor for Zero Books, I encouraged the publication of a kind of explainer on Firestone. So I do like care about this milieu. I'm very interested in this milieu. I would not say I am pro or anti-feminist. I've always said people should, I don't claim allyship nor denounce it. It's not something I feel like it is in my control. Some people think that's a cop-out, but I just think it's, to be honest, my politics about sex and gender are my own. And I don't necessarily trust people who try to declare their own allyship aspirationally or virtue signalingly or vice signalingly. So let's just get into this and get into the context and look at this old website because I kind of think it's one of the more, I mean, it's interesting when I'm talking about this and I'm like, this is from the 60s, but even the website feels very retro to us because this website is almost 20 years old itself. Hanisch is still alive, I believe, but she really hasn't been super active since 2013. Like I said, she published something with a bunch of people who were gender critical, and those essays range from full out trans exclusionary to not, but we can get into you know, some of the implications of all that. All right, let's get into the introduction. You're gonna have to forgive the columns here. I can see if I can zoom in and kind of make it less of a problem so you're not trying to read two essays at once. Oh, that's too close. All right. Introduction from 2006. The paper, The Personal is Political, was originally published in Notes from the Second Year Women's Liberation in 1970. I think it may have been circulated as early as 1969. That's me. It was widely reprinted and passed around the movement and beyond in the next several years. I do love the self-mythologizing so many people do when they like capitalize the movement or, you know, whatever we want to call it. I mean, we think about this with hashtags now, but this was a thing even as early as the 1960s, and definitely by 2006, which we're already dealing with the internet. You see this kind of mythologization that we kind of accuse baby boomers of all the time. All right. I didn't know just how much it had gotten around until I did a Google search and found it being discussed in many different languages. I mean, I could have told you that even in 2006. This was told to me by my colleagues, both radical and liberal, in my MFA program and in my philosophy program when I was in undergrad and graduate school. Yeah. All right. I would like to clarify for the record that I did not give the paper its title. The personal is political. As far as I know, that was done by the notes from the second year editors Shirley Firestone and Ann Coit after Kathy Sarachild brought it to their attention as a possible paper to be printed in that early collection. Also, political was used here in a broad sense of the word as having to do with power relationships, not the narrow sense of electoral politics. Already major difference between the way this was stated and the way this was repeated on social media in the aughts and aught teens. Like, identifying your partisan values as your personal morality was not what Hanisch was interested in. We might still disagree with Hanisch, but that wasn't what she was doing. All right. The paper actually began as a memo I wrote in February of 1969 while in Gainesville, Florida, when I was sent to the Women's Caucus of the Southern Educational Fund, a group for whom I was a subsistence paid organizer doing exploratory work for establishing a women's liberation project in the South. I think it's interesting also when we talk about like organizers for ideologies. They were paid pennies. They were professionals, but they were paid pennies back in the 60s and the early 70s when they were doing this work. Later on, when we had professional organizers around this stuff, because they were tied often into HR, frankly, and to the government and to the NGO industrial complex, you would hear people like Suey Park, the person who did the cancel Colbert thing, that really is where the word cancel culture took its popular name from. I know we've forgotten that. I know we've all dropped that, but cancel culture was a response to calling for canceling things like Colbert, the Colbert Report, when Colbert made a racist joke about Asians to point out the racism towards indigenous people being done in an ironic way. And of course it wasn't ironic because everything in Colbert at the time was done in a deliberately antagonistic and ironic pseudo-conservatism. Shortly after that, Colbert left the show anyway. It was already kind of stale by that point. But it's what spawned the first round of cancel culture. Now, Suey Park's story is interesting. She bragged at the time of losing $4,000 a week doing like diversity trainings to focus on cancel Colbert. I don't know if that was true, but that's what she claimed. $4,000 a week is not a ton of money. It's definitely not the money that you're talking about when you deal with like Robin DiAngelo and Abraham X. Kendi, not even a decade later. But it's way more money even compared to what we're talking about when we're talking about these new left organizers. I think Suey Park ended up disappearing from public life and became religious. So her story is actually somewhat sad. But it's interesting of a very particular moment of a very particular kind of politics that was really dominant on social media in the second half of the Obama administration. Now, that's over a decade old now anyway, and seems so irrelevant to Trump administration too, that even bringing it up, which was a big deal at the time. I mean, it was like the same kind of thing that we talk about Gamergate. Gamergate overshadows it because of the association with the manosphere and because that was about the right. Whereas cancel Colbert was really when cancellation discourse and call-out culture discourse became controversial even on the left, leading up to things like Mark Fisher in the UK talking about the Vampire Castle etc., etc., etc. So I think it's really important to contextualize the difference between what New Left activists were doing versus aught activists who were often doing the same kinds of things or each using the same kinds of phrases, but had a completely different context. Anyway, let's get back into it. The memo was originally titled Some Thoughts in Response to Dottie's Thoughts on Women's Liberation Movement. It was written in a reply to a memo by another staff member, Dottie Zellner, who contended that consciousness raising was just therapy and questioned whether the new independent women's liberation movement was really political. I think Dottie Zellner actually may have had a point, even though the consciousness raising things were based off of stuff going on in the Cultural Revolution. They really didn't take the same kind of tone because they weren't, you know, they weren't empowered in the same way. They weren't part of a conscious political economic response in the same way, but we can get back there. So we already see this tie-in with therapy. Susan Faludi would criticize Christopher Lasch for the backlash on this, but one of the things Christopher Lasch actually complained about was the rise of the therapeutic in activist culture, particularly in the way that a lot of these people move from being interested in social liberation. And this is not true of Carol Hanisch. Carol Hanisch, I think, has remained a radical feminist through her entire life, but became more just generic popular culture figures. You can think of Gloria Steinem here. In the interim period. And I think that's interesting. And it's also where stuff like this idea that was really popular in like 90s subcultures that your consumer and lifestyle choices were actually a manifestation of your politics. This was really big in zine culture. It was really debated in zine culture, both between, socialists and liberals, but also between different kinds of anarchists, like the Book Chin Bob Black debates get into this. Although none and one of them would have been particularly super happy with the way the person was political went. Anyway, let's get back to this. This was not an unusual reaction to radical feminist ideas in early 1969. The Women's Liberation Movement, the WLM groups, have been springing up all over the country and the world. Sure. Although they were very different in other parts of the world. The radical movements of civil rights, the anti-Vietnam War, and the old and new left groups from which many of us sprang were male-dominated and very nervous about women's generation in general, but especially the specter of mushrooming independent women's liberation movement, of which I was a staunch advocate. Arriving in New York City after 10 months in the Mississippi civil rights movement, I had found SCEF to be one of the more mature and better progressive groups around. It had a good record of racial, economic, and political justice work since the New Deal days, and I joined its staff in 1966 as the New York office manager. Now, I think this is something interesting because it actually does get to a point I made about the New Left. We associate the left with New York and California, which was true during the Popular Front during World War II and has been true probably since the 1970s, 1960s. I mean, the free speech movement started in Berkeley. Columbia was a major part of that as well. The student movement was actually very coastal. But a lot of these civil rights movements and more radical end of the civil rights movements were actually based in the upper Midwest and were doing incursions into the South. And they had ties into the Henry Wallace faction of the New Deal, the kind of Popular Front faction of the New Deal, when the progressives and social democrats were willing to work with the Soviets, et cetera, et cetera. They got purged by Truman, kind of, but they never completely went away. And in the upper Midwest, in particular, as I've talked about before, the Marxian professors were not purged thoroughly. It led to weird things. For example, one of the most radical economics departments in the country that's in a public school is actually here in Utah, the University of Utah. because they were willing to hire Keynesian and Marxian adjacent economists and sociologists out here to build their program, because it was very hard to get non-Mormons to come out here. So when people were fleeing, possibly getting purged during the Red Scare, and by purged, I don't mean killed, I mean, jobless. And they couldn't get to Europe, they would often come to places like Minnesota or even Utah and Colorado. And that's important to remember, although I will also say the radical feminist movement that Hanisch and Firestone and company were involved in was very much a kind of New York centered thing. So you see that kind of interrelation between kind of the classical centers of what was in the old left, although again, really the popular front old left, and what was trying to be done, which is pushing into the South, often from the Midwest, and those two things merging in the late 60s. All right, back to this. SCEF allowed the New York Radical Women to meet in its New York office where I worked, and at my request agreed to explore setting up a women's liberation project in the South. However, many on the SCEF staff, both men and women, ended up joining the criticism of women getting together in consciousness-raising groups to discuss their own oppression as navel-gazing and as personal therapy, and certainly not political. They could sometimes admit that women were oppressed, but only by the system, and said that we should have equal pay for equal work and other rights. But they belittled us no end for trying to bring our so-called personal problems in the public arena, especially all those bodily issues like sex, appearance, and abortion. Our demands that men share the housework and childcare were likewise deemed a personal problem between women and her individual man. It's interesting that's one of the things that was also picked up in the Italian autonomia around the same time. See the work of Frederici about that. The opposition claimed that if women would just stand up for themselves and take more responsibility for their own lives, they wouldn't need to have an independent women's movement for women's liberation. What personal initiative wouldn't solve, they said, the revolution would take care of if we would just shut up and do our part. Heaven forbid we should point out that men benefit from oppressing women. This style feels old-fashioned even in 2006. But anyway, recognizing the need to fight male supremacy as the movement instead blaming the individual woman for her oppression was the pro-woman line came in. It challenged the old anti-woman line that used spiritual, psychological, metaphysical, and pseudo-historical explanations for women's oppression with real materialist analysis for why women do what we do. By materialist, I mean in the Marxist materialist, based in reality sense, not in the desire for consumer goods sense. Taking the position that women were messed over, not messed up, took the focus off the individual struggle and put it on the group struggle, exposing the necessity for an independent women's liberation movement to deal with male supremacy. Now, I find this interesting because I'm sympathetic to this in terms of social reproduction. I'm actually sympathetic to some of these things because they do affect larger society. But I do find it interesting how this goes, because while they're talking about removing the onus of the individual, the focus on the individual consciousness really is a problem, particularly when you start combining this with privilege theory and standpoint epistemology. Now, I'm not going to go into standpoint epistemology here. It's still highly misunderstood. It comes from a particular reading of Lukács done by a bunch of Marxist feminists in the late 1960s, 1970s, about the time of this, but a different group. This is people around like Brown and Donna Haraway and people like that. So it comes out of a different but related milieu, and then you add to it Peggy McIntosh's privilege theory from the 80s, which is explicitly more liberal feminist. but one that tries to combine stuff coming from people like Kimberly Crenshaw and critical legal theory. You can see how all this takes the personal responsibility, moves it to the systemic, but then the systemic comes back on the personal when combined with other liberal ideas. And this really shows up, I think, in the 2010s. But I'm sympathetic to some of this because I do think, if you listen to what's being said, there is a total disregard for material incentives, for the divisions between men and women in a real sense, for the home economic sphere being treated as part of the economic sphere. But no good idea goes unpunished and unrecuperated, right? Anyway, back to this. The pro-woman line also helped challenge the sex role theory of women's oppression that said women act as we do because that's how we are taught by society. Now, this is interesting because this goes into their gender critique later, and this is picked up by radical feminists. By radical feminists, both in the when they were actually on the left line and in the wherever they are now line. And they is actually a much more diverse group than a lot of people give it credit for being. We can all think of things we were taught to do that we rejected once the forces that kept us thinking or doing them once removed. It was consciousness raising that led to the emergence of the pro-woman line with its scientific explanation based on an analysis of our experiences and an examination of who benefits from women's oppression. Now, you can see here that the radical feminists at this period are still using Marxist language and frameworks. That's going to drop from a lot of these people by the end of the 70s, but not Hanisch and not Firestone, although Firestone, I think, retires for public life because she ends up spending a lot of the last part of her life battling with schizophrenia. But this is important to know. Understanding that our oppressive situation was not our own fault, we were not, in the parlance of the time, all on our head, gave us a lot more courage as well as a more solid, real foundation on which to fight for liberation. Now, see here, this is saying that the patriarchy is not something that you're just internalized by a generic society. Now, I'm actually sympathetic to that line, but again, this is still kind of vague. Even though the who benefits stuff is actually really important. The personalist political paper and the theory it contains was my response to the heat of the battle to the attacks on us by SCF and the rest of the radical movement. I think it's important to realize that the paper came out of struggle, not just my struggle in the SCEF, but the struggle of the independent women's liberation movement against those who were trying to either stop it or to push it into directions that they found less threatening. It is also important to realize that the theory the paper contains did not come solely out of my individual brain. It came out of a movement. Now, notice that she didn't capitalize this one, the women's liberation movement, which she did capitalize, but that's fair. It's a specific one. And a specific group within that movement, the New York Radical Women, see, Hanisch, Firestone, etc. And a specific group within New York Radical Women, sometimes referred to as the pro-woman line faction. You'll notice a lot of structural resemblances to Maoist language when translated into English. This is where Maoist standard English comes from. And it became the parlance even of liberal activists by the 70s and 80s. And I think that does have to be noted. Of course, there were women within the New York Radical Women and the broader feminist movement who argued from the beginning against conscience raising and claimed that women were brainwashed and complicit in their own oppression, an argument rooted in the sociological and psychological rather than the political. They too helped the formulation of the pro-woman line theory. By arguing the then standard wisdom against us, they forced us to clarify and hone and develop and refine and articulate the new theory so that it could be spread more widely. After the New York Radical Women meeting, the pro-woman line faction would usually end up at Meters, a nearby restaurant that served fantastic apple pie a la mode. There we would discuss how the meeting had gone and the ideas that have been talked about until 2 or 3 in the morning, both agreeing with and challenging each other in wonderful lively debate amongst ourselves. In September of 1968, 6 months before the Personal is Political was written, the Miss America protest brought home to many why the pro-woman line theory we were developing was so important when it came to taking action outside the group. In another paper entitled A Critique of the Miss America Protest, I wrote about how the anti-woman faction of the protesters distracted from our marriage that all women are oppressed by beauty standards, even the contestants. Signs like Up Against the Wall in Miss America and Miss America is a Big Falsie made these contestants out to be our enemy instead of the men and bosses who impose the false beauty standards on women. Now, again, this comes out of a radical line that has a lot of Maoist origins, at least both later in 1996. Hanisch is defending the Maoist origins of this, and you can see it in here. The verbiage is from that political milieu. But by the 1990s, this has all been recuperated in the like standard feminism, both in the third wave and in the intersectional movements. And I put that in quotation marks because the naming of those movements really comes post facto as a kind of liberal activist historiography. Some of those people that think of themselves that way, I mean, Crenshaw definitely did, but I took several women's studies classes that didn't mention it in that way at that time. All right. Political struggle or debate is the key to good political theory. A theory is just a bunch of words, sometimes interesting to think about, but just words nevertheless until it's tested in real life. I think a theory is more than just words. I think it's the whole mental apparatus. But I still think until it is tested, you don't know if it has any correspondence to material reality at all. And how you figure out the correspondence isn't simple. Sometimes it's predictability. Sometimes it's success at goals. Sometimes it's the way in which other people can incorporate it into their lives. Sometimes how faithful does the ideology remain to its core mission as situations change, because situations are ever fluid. There's all kinds of ways you can interpret that. Many a theory has delivered surprises, both positive and negative, when an attempt has been made to put it into practice. You can't separate theory from praxis, people, because praxis is how you see if theory is true. Actually, I would say praxis and poesis, so both practicing and making is how you prove a theory as correspondence to anything true. All right. While trying to think how I would change the personal political paper if I could rewrite it with today's hindsight, I was actually surprised how well it stands the test of time and experience. There are a few things I would elaborate on, like my simplistic definition of class. We'll see if I might agree with your simplistic definition. And there are a few statements in the paper that are indeed badly in need of further development. Perhaps the two that bothers me the most are women are smart not to struggle alone, and it is no worse to be in the home than in the rat race of the job world. The first statement doesn't mean that women are smart not to struggle at all, as sometimes interpreted by the pro-woman line. Women are sometimes smart not to struggle alone when they can't win, and the repercussions are worse than oppression. However, individual struggle does sometimes get us some things. And when women's liberation is at a low tide or invisible, it may be the best we can do. We need to be always pushing the envelope. Even when the women's liberation movement is at high tide, because our oppression often takes place in isolated circumstances like the home, it takes individual action to put into practice what the movement is fighting for. What the movement is capitalized in this is actually interesting. It's like if you didn't capitalize God all the time. But anyway, but the individual struggle is always limited. It is going to take an ongoing movement stronger than any we've seen so far to put a nail into male supremacy. On the second point, I've come to agree with Susan B. Anthony that to be free, a woman must have a purse of her own. Women can't be independent without participating in the public workforce. Now, this is something that Lash actually critiqued, and one of the critiques that I had, many of Lash's critiques of the feminist movement I actually don't agree with. I've talked about this in the past, particularly by his debate with Lindley and Rubin in the mid 80s. That was republished in Tikkun magazine issue 1, I think. I would say that women can't be independent without participating in the public workforce is both absolutely true, but also it had other implications about how you could restructure the workforce with the entrance of women as part of the household wage, actually allowing for the depression of wages not to become obvious when that depression of wages is done through inflation. And that was a point that Lash made that I do think actually is pretty pernicious about why the corporate world was willing to push a lot of otherwise radical seeming stuff around women's liberation. Some of it was to comply with federal work orders, but some of it was because if you had two earners in the home, you could use that as a justification for not adjusting your wages for inflation. Because after all, there's two workers maintaining the home, not one now. So you don't need to pay as much in actual purchasing power. Anyway, back to this. That also means that uniting in a fight for the public child care and for the restructuring of the workplace with women's equity in mind, while insisting that men share housework and child care on the home front, so women didn't end up having to do it all. Which I will say by 2005, it's pretty clear that women were ending up having to do it all. They were still doing the brunt of childcare. They increasingly weren't getting married at all, particularly poor women who had less access to the things that make marriage seem viable. While people may talk about, well-off women can't find enough well-off men to marry, they're still more likely to marry than their poorer counterparts. That's a statistical fact today. So the home front still is actually kind of important, and women did up having to do a lot of it all. I wish I could have anticipated all the ways that the personalist, political, and the pro-one line would be revised and misused. I think even if I disagree with what she says this is, and I have some, you guys can hear I have some subtle critiques. I want to be clear that the way this was used, particularly by the time I'm an adult, is so radically worse than, or even when I was a teenager. I mean, I heard the personalist political when I was in high school doing zine work, in like semi-exurban / rural Georgia. But anyway, like most theories created by the pro-woman line radical feminists, these ideas have been revised or ripped off or even stood on their head and used against their original radical intent. Well, it's necessary that these theories take their knocks in the real world like anything else. Many of us have learned that once they leave our hands, they need to be defended against revisionism and misuse. What follows is the original Personalist Political as edited from the memo for the 1970 anthology, Notes from the Second Year, Women's Liberation, edited by Shula Firestone, and Ann Code, Carol Hanisch, and that's from 2006. It's still pretty long ago. Let's go back up here. Now, this is the original piece, and note that it's not much longer than the explanation for it. One thing I find interesting is while this phrase is used all the time, I rarely see this article cited. I see the Peggy McClintock radical knapsack, which I think, frankly, is a much more shallow piece of politics and comes from a completely different period, actually cited. Or I see Kimberly Crenshaw's legal papers about using intersectionality for legal analysis when dealing with personal rights actually cited. I don't see this actually cited that much. I see this phrase repeated, often removed from this debate entirely, but for things that I really wouldn't even consider to be therapy or therapeutic, they would be consumerist. But anyway, February 1969, and again, I think it's published in 1970. For this paper, I want to stick pretty pretty close to an aspect of the left debate commonly talked about, namely therapy versus therapy in politics. Another name for it is personal versus political, and it has other names. Those aren't really the same thing, though, but I get it. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, even though those are they rhyme. Their family resemblances are strong, but the personal versus political and the therapy versus politics debate are actually kind of different. Although that may be your point here too. I suspect as it is developed across the country, I haven't gone over to visit the New Orleans group yet, but I have been participating in groups in New York and Gainesville, Florida, for more than a year. Both of these groups have been called therapy and personal groups by women who consider themselves more political. Notice this is an interfeminist debate. So I must speak about the so-called therapy groups from my own experience. Now, I think this is interesting. I wonder what Hanisch, I mean, she's old now, but I do believe she's still alive, would say about the way we use therapy now versus the way it was talked about in 2006 or the way it was talked about in the 60s and early 70s. The word therapy is a very obvious misnomer if carried to its logical conclusion. Therapy assumes that someone is sick and there is a cure, e.g., a personal solution. Now that's interesting because even therapists would actually, like David Smiles and some other people would actually critique that today. I am greatly offended that I or any other woman is thought to need therapy in the first place. Well, women are not messed over. Women are messed over, not messed up. I would love to know what Hanisch says about truly fire-thrown schizophrenia. Truly fire-thrown schizophrenia. I actually would love to know that. If she thinks that was a social result or a biochemical result or somewhere in between. My personal opinion is probably somewhere in between. The social conditions actually set the way physical manifestations happen, even for certain diseases. So I do think it's something like certain biological diseases that have a whole lot of biological correlates. And schizophrenia does. Certain other psychoanalytic diagnoses do not, but nonetheless. We need to change the objective conditions, not just adjust to them. It's interesting that I hear this so much now. I heard this from Fisher, although in a completely different context, but it was the same line of argument. Therapy is adjusting to your bad personal alternative. I mean, I would agree in a lot of cases. But it's interesting that today that like the personalist political is taken to actually include therapy as part of the political statement. So again, see the change in the development here. We have not done much trying to solve the immediate personal problems of women in the group. We've mostly picked topics by two methods. In a small group, it is possible for us to take turns bringing the question to the meeting, like, which did you prefer, a girl or a boy baby or no children, and why? What happens to your relationship if your man makes more money than you, less than you? You know, those kind of questions. Then we go around the room answering the questions from our personal experience. Everybody talks that way. And at the end of the meeting, we try to sum up and generalize from what's been said and make connections. Now, one reason why I suspect this hasn't been cited as much is because it's written clearly. I actually find it interesting that, she talks in what I would call Maoist inflected activist talk in the 2006. I actually don't see a lot of that in the original memo. That's interesting. And this is very direct. I believe at this point, and maybe for a long time to come, that these analytical sessions are a form of political action. Interesting. So they're like workers' inquiry, actually. And I would not necessarily just if workers' inquiry, if knowing what workers are feeling and doing is part of figuring out what you need to do to organize workers, then if you wanted to deal with women workers or deal with women in society, you would need to do these kind of things. It wouldn't be therapeutic. It would actually be information gathering. But the tying it to consciousness raising is going to be interesting. And I want to see where this goes. I do not go to these sessions because I need or want to talk about my personal problems. In fact, I would rather not. As a movement woman, I've been pressured to be strong, selfless, other-oriented, sacrificing, in general, pretty much in control of my own life. To admit to the problems in my life is to be deemed weak. So I want to be a strong woman in movement terms and not admit that I have any real problems that I can't find a personal solution to, except those directly related to the capitalist system. I mean, I often get that way. It is at this point a political action to tell it like it is, to say what I really believe about my life instead of what I've always been told to say. So the reason I participate in these meetings is not to solve any personal problem. One of the first things we discover in these groups is that the personal problems are political problems. There are no personal solutions at this time. There is only collective action for a collective solution. I went and I continue to go to these meetings because I've gotten my political understanding, which all my reading, all my political sessions, all my political action, all my 4 odd years in the movement never gave me. Now, this is interesting because the personalist political here really doesn't have the valiances of personal expression that Lash is critiquing the culture of narcissism, or that I saw with the invocations of the personalist political about, say, I'm only reading female authors because my personal consumer choice has a political valiance. Right? This is not from the world of politics as fandoms and fandoms as politics. But with the phrase the personalist political as it was used often in social media and on college campuses, from after social media, you're dealing with at least LiveJournal. So that's like the early aughts. And MySpace, which is the early aughts. By the time you get to like Facebook and Twitter, you're dealing with the late aughts. But nonetheless, what you're seeing here is a real shift of the discussion. Like, it really is different the way this phrase was used by even, intersectional feminists who were talking about media choices in the early teens and late aughts, from what they're talking about back here, which is understanding the social reproduction milieu, right? To use like Marxist technical jargon, which I actually appreciate that Carol Hanisch was not using. Now, I still think some of the more pernicious elements may be here this early. I talked about the kind of paradox of talking about this collectively, but still focusing on consciousness, which is an individual thing. But nonetheless, I mean, it's not like that paradox isn't in Marxism. We don't shut the fuck up about workers' consciousness. But workers' consciousness is supposed to move from the in itself, which would be aggregates of individuals and their individual consciousness, to the for itself, which would be a collective, individual dialectic that manifests in a movement with clear goals. So in some ways, when Marxists are like, oh, look at these liberal feminists, we don't do that. Well, actually, you kind of do. So they're not getting this from nowhere. All right. Notice I also said these meetings sound a lot to me like workers' inquiry as much as they do therapy. But you can see how this could be turned on its head for therapeutic reasons very easily, actually. But anyway. I went and continue to go to these meetings because I have gotten a political understanding, which all my reading, all my political discussions, all my political action, all my 4 odd years in the movement never gave me. I've been forced to take off the rose-colored glasses and face the awful truth about how grim my life really is as a woman. I'm getting a gut understanding of everything as opposed to the esoteric intellectual understanding and noblesse oblige feelings I had at other people's struggles. I also don't trust people who are constantly trying to safeguard and ally people who don't have skin in their people who they don't really have skin in their game. I do think you should help people who don't have skin in your game. Absolutely. But if that's your primary focus, it does feel noblesse oblige or virtual signally or something. It feels like you're actually hiding something else to me. But anyway. This is not to deny that these sessions have at least 2 aspects that are therapeutic. I prefer to call even this aspect political therapy as opposed to personal therapy. The most important is getting rid of self-blame. This is where we can see how this can be co-opted by consumerist and liberal ideology. This right here. But I'm glad she's talking about it. Can you imagine what would happen if women, blacks, and workers, my definition of worker is that anyone who has to work for a living as opposed to those who don't, all women are workers, would stand up, blaming ourselves for our sad situations? Yeah, okay, I do see. Even by my relatively broad definition of working class, that's too broad of a definition, because the people, but the petite bourgeois people have to work. Like, this isn't even limited by earning a wage. I tend to think if you earn a wage, then it counts as a worker, and social reproduction work. I'm not sure that commodifying it actually would be super great, but it does have to be acknowledged as a great unpaid part of our society that really holds a whole lot of things up. And as it shreds apart, you see the problems with that. And I do think we do see real problems with it, and leftists do have to look at it more than they do. Leftist discussions of kids are usually pretty pie in the sky, because it doesn't even deal with them and like as an allo parent or a teacher or a society figure, much less as a parent. Allo parent, for those of you who don't know, is someone who helps raise people's kids who are not their direct offspring. Sometimes they are genetically related to you, but they are not your seed. Anyway, or your egg. All right. But I mean, I think this is interesting because on one hand, I think it is important to get rid of self-blame, and in some cases too. I actually do think that. But you can definitely see how this can be abused and recuperated for consumerist or liberal reasons. You can see how the personal is political when you don't have this context becomes a real problem. And I do wonder if, in addition to this being like too clear to be sexy, this is also a lot of the uses of the personal political are actually out of junction with what this is talking about, so they don't want to mention it, or they just don't know about it. But some people knew about it at one point. I mean, I don't think, like, the number of people who I could ask where did personalist political come from is much less than when I ask you where did intersectionality come from. Most people with a humanities degree or have spent time on the internet could probably tell you Kimberly Crenshaw. But yeah, all right. But it's interesting because this has, like, all workers should stop blaming themselves for their sad situation. So this is like proto-intersectional, but not in the way that we would use it later, right? They would talk about this in terms of solidarity. It seems to me that the whole country needs the kind of political therapy. This is why the Black movement is doing it in its own way. We shall do it in ours. We are only starting to stop blaming ourselves. We also feel like we are thinking for ourselves for the first time in our lives. As a cartoon in Lilith puts it, that was a magazine that was still around when I was in high school. I am changing. My mind is growing muscles. Those who believe that Marx, Lenin, Engels, and Mao and Ho have the only and last good word on the subject, and that women have nothing more to add, will, of course, find these groups a waste of time. So this stuff gets picked up by people. I remember reading a whole lot of Marxist skepticism that, like, totally drops, the socialist element to a lot of these early feminist thinkers, even in people like the poet Adrienne Rich, because this line of thought, like, we shouldn't just quote Marx, Lenin, Engels, or Mao and Ho to have the only good word on the subject and nothing more to be possibly added. It became like we shouldn't listen to any of these men ever. But anyway, I mean, not that not really was clear to me that Adrienne Rich wrote on Ruta Donetskaya in a way that actually I don't think was completely all that helpful in understanding Ruta Donetskaya. But anyway, back to this. The groups that I have been in have also not gotten into alternative lifestyles or what it means to be a liberated woman. We came early to the conclusion that all alternatives are bad under present conditions. That's also very different from personalist political stuff in the 90s, aughts, and aught teens, isn't it? This has a critique of lifestylism, and I've seen personal as political to defend partisan morality and lifestylism in my lifetime. That's mostly what it's been used to defend. It's critiqued here. Now, again, you don't have to accept all that Hanisch is offering, and I haven't seen a whole lot of things I would totally object to, but I would say there's a whole lot of things that I think are under theorized or under dealt with here. But plain reading, I think this is somewhat reasonable. People have to know what their conditions are in social reproduction. To do that, you need to talk. That talk is going to look like therapy because it could deal with the elements of social reproduction. Elements of social reproduction are your relationships, how domestic economics works, who rears children and how, those are how do you educate them? Those are social reproduction issues. You cannot deal with a society and produce relations of production or, life at all without dealing with that stuff. All right. Whether we live with or without a man, communally or in couples or alone, are married or unmarried, live with other women, go for free rubs, celibacy or lesbianism, or any combination, there are only good and bad things about each bad situation. There is no more liberated way. There are only bad alternatives. This actually sounds a lot like the Adorno phrase, "A wrong life cannot be lived lightly," one of my favorite phrases. So I'm kind of sympathetic to this because I'm always like, your alternative prefigurative lifestyles are, even when they're not consumer choices, are still totally rooted in the society that you live in now. It is hard to even imagine what a radically different society would be, even if you have radical ideas. All right. This is part of the most important theories we're beginning to articulate. We call it the pro-woman line. What it says basically is that women are really neat people. Okay, that's dated. Bad things that are said about us as women are either myths, women are stupid, tactics women use to struggle individually, women are bitches, are actually things that we want to carry on into a new society and want men to share too. Women are sensitive and emotional. Women as oppressed people act out of necessity, act dumb in the presence of men, not out of choice. Women have to develop great shuffling techniques for our own survival, look pretty and giggle to get or keep a job or a man, which should be used when necessary until such time as the power of unity can take its place. Women are smart, not to struggle alone, as are blacks and workers. It is no worse to be in the home than it is to be in the rat race of the job world. They are both bad. Women, like blacks, workers, must stop blaming ourselves for our own failures. I do find it interesting that these lists of things, workers, which is one type of thing, blacks, which is in another category of things, which is race, and women, which is another category of things, which is sex, are listed as if you're not overlapping. Well, I get that is a point of like intersectional theory, but I mean, it's just interesting to see how it's written about in this time period. I'm not critiquing this in a particularly deep way. I don't think it like betrays some inner liberalism or some inner essentialism or something. Or some category error necessarily. I just think it's interesting how that language has shifted in both radical and liberal discourse since this was written. It took us some 10 months to get to the point where we could articulate these things and relate them to the lives of every woman. It's important from the standpoint of what kind of action we are going to do. When our first group started, going by majority opinion, we have been out in the streets demonstrating against marriage, against having babies, for free love, against women who wore makeup, against housewives, for equality without recognition of biological differences, and God knows what else. This is interesting because there's some implicit critiques about things normally associated with this period of feminism here. Now we see all these things as what we call personal solutionary. Many of the actions taken by action groups have been along these lines. I find this interesting because the personalist political is actually critiquing some of the same things the personalist political is used to defend when I was coming up in radical circles and alienated me from it. I'm not saying this is like a magical, mystical secret code to feminism in a way that socialists could totally adopt to. I don't think that. But it's just clearly amazing how far that term that this essay is titled with moved away from what this was actually about. And I think it's implicit in the term, actually, that it would move away that way. There are key problems in the term. But it's just interesting when they're talking about the lifestylism and protesting lifestylism, like whether or not you have children, whether or not you're for free love, whether or not you wear makeup, whether or not you're housewives, whether or not you get equality with or without biological differences, is all personal for this. And that's actually taken as a critique of them. Whereas you would hear the personalist political today to be brought up about the things this thing is critiquing. And I find it interesting because you also know the personalist political is not used in this article because the writer of the article didn't name it that. But anyway, many of these actions taken by action groups have been along these lines. Women who did the anti-woman stuff at the Miss America pageant were the ones who were screaming for action without theory. And again, the personalist political is also used to decry the need for theory. My God, man, how much can this have been perverted and recuperated for what it's critiquing within the feminist movement? Notice this is a critique of the feminist movement from the feminist movement. This is not just a critique of everyday life. The members of one group want to set up a private daycare center without any real analysis of what could be done to make it better for little girls, much less any analysis of how the center hastens the revolution. This is not to say, of course, that we shouldn't do action. There may be some very good reasons why women in the group don't want to do anything at the moment. One reason I have is that this thing is so important to me that I want to be very sure that we're doing the best way we know how, and that it is the right action that I feel sure about. I refuse to go out and produce for the movement. I've had a lot of conflicts in our New York group about whether or not to do action. When the Miss America protest was proposed, there was no question, but we wanted to do it. Sick with the comma there. I think it was because we all saw how it related to our lives. We felt it was a good action, and there were things wrong with the action, but the basic idea was there. This has been my personal experience with being accused of being a therapy or personal. Perhaps certain groups may well be attempting to do therapy. Yeah, a lot of them are, and that's going to become a bigger problem. Hindsight, particularly, it's going to be a bigger problem even after 2006. All right. Maybe the answer is not to put down the method of analyzing from personal experience in favor of immediate action, but to figure out what can be done to make it work. Theory needs to be for something, guys and peeps. Some of us start to write a handbook about this at one time and never got it past the outline. We are working on it again and hope to have it out in the month at the latest. It is true we all need to draw better conclusions from the experiences and feelings we talk about and how to draw all kinds of connections. Some of us haven't done a very good job of communicating them to others. One more thing. I think we must listen to what the so-called apolitical women have to say, not so we can do a better job of organizing them, but because together we are a mass movement. I say that about people talking to workers all the time. I think we who work full-time in the movement tend to become very narrow. Yeah, you think? You think doing this as your living limits how your view of how other people live? This is part of the reason why I'm not a professional political agitator or a professional leftist media organizer. I do get paid for this, so I guess I'm semi-pro. But this is not the way I earn the majority of my living for a reason. I think we who work full-time in this movement tend to become very narrow. What is happening now is that when a non-movement woman disagree with us, we assume it's because they are apolitical, not because there might be something wrong with our thinking. This is very subtle and very direct, but this does have a very mass line way of thinking in it. So my whole thing about the radical, particularly out of New York, the radical women's movement or radical women's liberation movement was actually tied into Maoism is only apparent. It's very apparent in the explanatory essay, but it's only apparent in this essay here, I think. Women have left the movement in droves. The obvious reasons are that we are tired of being sex slaves and doing shit work for men whose hypocrisy is so blatant in their political stances of liberation for everybody else. But there's really a lot more to it than that. I can't really articulate it yet, but I think apolitical women are not in the movement for very good reasons. And as long as all we have to say is you have to think like us and live like us to join our charm circle, we will fare. Absolutely. Also, all other politicos fucking listen to that. If you need total ideological consistency or total moral consistency, you're doomed. What I am trying to say is there are things that in the consciousness of apolitical women, I find them very political, that are as valid as any political consciousness we think we have. I do like this self-reflection here, actually. We should figure out why so many women don't want to do action. Maybe there's something wrong with the action, or something wrong with why we are doing the action, or maybe the analysis of why the action is necessary is not clear enough in our minds. That's it. That's the end of the article. I think this is a good place to see how a lot of these famous phrases have been so thoroughly recuperated. But I also say there are little poison pills in here that I do not think are necessarily from Hanisch's thinking, but like the focus on removing shame, which may very well be something you need to do. I mean, Fisher talked about his depression as just a manifestation of being shamed as a worker, although his definition of worker was someone who was born from people in the working class in the British sense of that term, which is a born into class thing. The way that like Americans view college education as somehow magically changing your class status, regardless of what you actually do with it or how much you even earn with it. Nonetheless, I have critiques of that, and critiques of that in Fisher too. And I also think, no, sometimes depression might be social, but sometimes it may actually be a problem in your biochemistry that we don't entirely understand either way and don't have necessarily good answers for. But I do think that a little, say, anti-psychiatric and maybe even psychological skepticism is sometimes needed. But not too much, because you don't want to deny people who actually need help their help. That's why I said I'd love to talk to Hanisch about how she feels about what happened with Firestone and schizophrenia. Anyway, here we go. I think this essay is actually useful to read. I find it interesting that as much as this phrase is used, and again, Hanisch didn't coin the phrase. In fact, she didn't even use it in the article it was given to her. It's used in ways to talk about the things she's critiquing off it in this essay. Make of that what you will. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. I have more behind the Patreon. I'm getting back in regular production. I like to thank all my high-level supporters. And I hope you learn something from these engagements. I do them for educational reasons and out of interest. Some people have questioned why I don't just summarize the article or read the article to you first. It would be easier to listen to, I'm sure. But I actually, when I read this to you, I don't expect my reading to be a substitute for you reading it yourself. And I am modeling the way I think through an essay like I do when I teach high school students how to close read, because a lot of people will trust summaries from people who are bad close readers who don't really understand the text they're talking about. And if they do understand the words of the text, they definitely don't understand the context. And there's a whole lot of bad political education out there from that. It's very degenerate. You don't want to get into it too deeply. And I want to show the sausage, so to speak, on how I actually arrive at thinking through some of these essays and what they mean. Anyway, that's all. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, take care of yourself. And no matter how chaotic it gets, you got to protect your peace. You can't help others if you're yourself need too much help to function.